Hello and welcome to ICT for Education's interview series covering hot topics for schools in the primary and secondary sector. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm the editor at ICT for Education. Today I'd like to welcome Pete Collison, Head of Formative Assessment and School Platforms Technology at RM. Pete, please tell us a little bit about yourself and then we'll talk about assessment.
Yeah, super. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for having me come along today. It's a pleasure to talk to you. So as you say, I'm Head of Formative Assessment at RM Education. I've been really proud to have worked for RM for the best part of 20 years now, and pretty much all of my career has been focused in and around the education space and helping schools, colleges, universities really embrace technology for the benefit of improving pupil outcomes and quality of education. So really excited to talk to you today. It'd be good to get into some interesting topics around assessment.
Great, fantastic. So we are going to talk about assessment, and here is your first question. What impact has COVID had on the assessment landscape?
Yeah, it's pretty profound, I think, in a fair few places, as it has been on so many landscapes globally. I think I'd probably break it down into three sort of categories of impact, really. The first and probably the most sort of publicly visible impact is that of sort of school level high stakes summative assessments, so A levels and GCSEs. You know, pretty much all of us will have been aware of what happened in summer 20 when those exams were cancelled at reasonably short notice. Alternative arrangements had to be put in place, and computer algorithms did or didn't do a particularly good job of some of that, and you know, long debated, and one not to delve into too much today, but that was a very obviously public impact of that. And I think you know, this summer will equally be affected again. We know that the majority, if not all, exams are being cancelled. There are some significant differences this time around, though, so there's very good reason to have confidence in the system going forward, which is great. And interestingly, RM has recently done some research specifically around this. It's due to be published soon, which shows that certainly from a secondary school teacher perspective, there's really high levels of confidence in the system going into summer 20, that the alternative arrangements will be suitable. Some sort of nearly 80% of teachers reporting that they were very confident in the alternative arrangements. By contrast, however, just 5% of exam board contacts that we asked said that they were very confident in the system going forward. We should note that the sample size for exam boards was quite small, and we should also note that these questions were being posed in February when some of the detail was still being worked out. But nevertheless, that there's clearly quite a lot of discussion to be had there, and big differences in confidence. So I think that's definitely an area that has impacted, will continue to impact, and has got some distance to travel. The second area, probably less visible, but a lot of really great stuff is happening, is in the university space. So there's been a lot in the press about students returning to campus or not returning to campus, value for money of tuition fees. Not really much around assessment, actually. The universities have just kind of got on with it, and broadly have done a pretty good job, I think. They've done some really interesting things within their sector, like you sort of en masse embracing open book exams, you know, complete changes to their assessment process away from closed hall sort of invigilated exams through to something much more open and much more flexible. And pedagogically, that's a really big step forward, and we're hearing lots of positive things from both the candidates and the lecturers and educators about that. So definitely some nuggets in there around HE, which maybe we'll come back to as we talk further. The third area, which I think is the area that's been sort of put on the back burner. I don't think it's been forgotten about, but I think it has been put down the priority list. Is that of formative assessment. So that sort of informal, regular, frequent assessment of pupils' learning as they're going through a learning journey. When lockdowns first started to happen, schools and colleges and universities quite rightly focused all of their efforts on how do we ensure the continuation of learning. You know, quite right, quite understandable, exactly the right thing to do. Less thought was put into how do we assess that learning? How do we assess the gaps that may exist when pupils return to school, etc.? So I think that's the area that probably now needs a bit of focus as we go forward, and perhaps hasn't had quite the visibility of some of the other examples that I talked about.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And sort of, are these changes for the better, and will they last? You mentioned higher education sector. Will some of that, do you think, filter down into the secondary sector? How do you see that panning out?
Yeah, I think definitely some of them will last, and I mean, and some of the changes have been better than others. So I think the good changes are here to stay. The ones that were perhaps reactive changes or were to solve an immediate solution, but perhaps were not ideal, I think they will inevitably fall away and the system will improve. But I do think we've come too far now to ever fully go back to the old way of doing things, the old normal, if you will. And indeed, I mean, just yesterday, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Education Technology published its first report looking specifically at lessons from lockdown. And that report makes a raft of really interesting and in some cases challenging recommendations to government, to the Department for Education and the education system generally, about stuff that should quite rightly be here to stay, and there's some many examples I could call out, but something that really struck me was the progress we've made in ensuring that disadvantaged pupils can engage in education through digital technology. Pupils that might find it hard to physically attend school for all manner of reasons, but may be able to engage digitally and remotely much more easily. Some fantastic stuff that's been done there, and that absolutely should be here to stay. From an assessment point of view specifically, I think there's a couple of good examples there. If we remember that assessment systems, by and large, should exist on a few core principles around fairness, accessibility, and trust, then I think if we keep those in mind, this idea of open book exams, I think, becomes quite appealing, because you're changing what you're assessing, oversimplifying here, but these exams should be more Google proof. It moves us away from essay mills and all these things that get a lot of public attention at the moment. It's also a much more authentic assessment experience. Students don't like spending 3 hours in a school sports hall sat at a desk with a piece of paper in front of them and a calculator and nothing else. That's an alien environment to all of the rest of the learning experiences they have. So I think anything that moves us away from that model is to be applauded, and we should look carefully at. I think the second thing that definitely should be here to stay is just in general the adoption of digital assessment technologies. So digitizing the entire exam process, not just bits of the workflow, but simply because that just generates so much interesting and valuable data and is such a more efficient way of doing things. I think that will be a lasting legacy of this and will flow down into schools. It's not happening in huge volumes in that sector at the moment, but I think it should.
Okay, so looking at the school situation sort of in the digital world, they should perhaps be looking more at tech for assessment, and how could they do that? How could they approach that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think they should, as I mentioned a moment ago. So there is a lot of growing evidence now that digital assessment systems and platforms aren't just the reserve anymore of high stakes endpoint assessments that get delivered by exam boards. RM is working on a couple of projects around this. One with an examination board in Australia, who are using our platform to deploy formative assessments into the classroom, not to award final certifications, but to help and support teachers understand where their class is at, where their learners are at, what do they know, what don't they know, to make those sort of on-the-fly adjustments to their teaching as they go. So that's a really interesting example, and I think we will see more and more of that, sort of those use of that real high-strength technology in a far less formal environment. So I think we'll see that. We will also see, I think, some more innovative uses of assessment come out. Something else that RM are working on quite a lot at the moment is the concept of comparative judgment as an assessment methodology. It's an alternative to traditional marking, lends itself particularly well to assessing work that is subjective in nature, creative work. So creative writing and art and design and drama, music, dance, all of those things where there's no definitive right or wrong. So we're seeing some really interesting innovation and new approaches come out there. And taking a digital approach to them just makes it so much more efficient to roll out and deploy and to access both in school and at home. So I think, you know, we will still have that blended world of learning. You know, learning doesn't just happen within the school physical building anymore. You know, the school is now a digital entity. So I think we will see a lot more of that going forward, and rightly so. I think that's all for the benefit of the learner, that they're good assessment experiences to engage with.
Yeah, that's yeah, I think, as you said earlier, that it's certainly a result of the pandemic, just widening the learning area for children from home and school, and for teachers. Talking about the tech, though, let's go to the extreme, or the extreme as we know it at the moment, and talk a little bit about AI and automation of assessment. I think some people feel very comfortable with this, and some people may not feel very comfortable with this. What's the effect there, sort of, for the students, the teachers, the outcomes? Obviously, the AI has to be explainable. What are people thinking there?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? So let's. I think it's important to make a distinction between automation and AI. That they do often get lumped together, but they are quite different things. So if we think about automation first, that's probably, I guess, the slightly less controversial end of things. So in this case, automation in the assessment world it exists. The technology is there. It's been around for a while, and what it would typically look like is using technology to automate workflow, so automatically assigning assignments to a class of pupils based upon data in the school management system. So automating sort of the admin processes of setting an assignment, gathering marks, and handling that. That's all great. That's fine. I don't think anybody would argue that that's not a good thing. It's also entirely possible to automatically create assessment content now. Some subjects it lends itself to better than others. Maths is a good example, where if you set the parameters of a particular question, then you know the system can automatically fiddle with the variables to make many different versions of that same question. So, you know, creating assessment material in some cases can be automated. And I don't think that's an overly controversial piece. It is also possible, and it happens quite a lot, to automate some of the marking of assessment. And the most obvious example is multiple choice questions, yes, where you know there is a right answer and a collection of wrong answers. You can automate the marking of that. That's dead simple. And actually now we're also starting to see the automatic generation of feedback against that. So, for example, through clever assessment design, it's now increasingly common that if you have a multiple choice question, you'll have a correct answer, and some of the incorrect answers will be designed to flush out common misunderstandings. So they won't just be random wrong answers, they'll be really intelligently selected answers. And attached to that can be some feedback that says to the student, well, if you selected this answer, we're pretty sure that you've got this misunderstanding. So here's some feedback to help you address that. So automating that, I think, you know, it is possible. It's not suitable in all subjects, but it can get there and it can happen. And I think all of that is good, and we'll see more of that because it's efficient. It's a good way of doing things, and it's still unique to the user. AI is a slightly trickier argument here. I think we need to be careful that a lot of people use the phrase inappropriately when they talk about AI, when that's not really what they're talking about. In assessment, I think there are some good examples of where our AI can make a difference. So the most obvious of which is adaptive testing. So this is where an assessment will call upon a large bank of questions, and the system will choose which question to call for a particular candidate based upon their previous answers. So if I got a whole bunch of questions correct and I was performing well, the system might choose slightly harder questions for me. So that's good, because the assessment now becomes personal to me. And if I am particularly good at the subject, I get challenged to progress my knowledge further. Similarly, if I'm less able with a subject, the system can dial back so that I'm not receiving questions that I just can't answer, and therefore I'm getting stressed and demotivated and all of these things. So I think, you know, where we do see AI having a place, it's in that sort of personalization piece. You know, nobody with assessment wants to be in a scenario where the computer says no, and therefore someone's end result, their grade, their chances of progression to further education are hampered because of a computer saying no. RM never wants to be in that place. I don't think that's a good place to be. But I think we can do some really clever stuff around personalising the feel of assessment, and AI has definitely got a role to play there. And of course, both of these things add up to freeing up the teacher and freeing up their time to ultimately build stronger connections with their students. And that's really what this is all about. It's not there to in any way detract from that, quite the contrary. Education is at its best when the link between the educator and the learner is strong, and assessment should support that.
Right. And you're working on AI, in this case machine learning, I guess.
Yeah.
And have you worked with schools on it? Is that beginning to come through?
We certainly have, yeah. I mean, I gave you a couple of examples earlier of some things we're doing in Australia. So that platform is an adaptive testing platform. So that platform will use that kind of methodology. And actually, the example I gave earlier about comparative judgment, the platform that RM uses for that also uses some AI in the background to intelligently choose which pieces of work get presented for evaluation, so that teachers aren't wasting their time, but also you're getting to high levels of reliability as quickly as possible. So definitely we're starting to see that play in now. I think it needs to be done in quite a controlled manner. It's a bit like self-driving cars, isn't it? We make steps of progress, but no one, I don't think, is quite yet ready to fully take their hands off their wheel and fall asleep in the back. Whether it's right that we get to that stage in assessment, whether it's right that assessment never gets seen by a human, personally I'm not comfortable with that, but that's my view, maybe not the view of others.
That's interesting. I would guess it's a human in the loop kind of thing, ultimately, because we are talking only about people at the end of the day. Yeah,
I think you're right. It's an augmentation proposition, I think, that is the most powerful one and the most effective one.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So this, in a great part, Pete, has been a sort of COVID has been the catalyst for some of this development and thinking.
Yeah, it really has. And I think it has really enabled conversations to be had that were being had before, but there were lots of good excuses. I'll use that term probably ill-advisedly. Lots of good reasons why change didn't happen. There was always a good reason to do it. Well, we'll do it next term, or we'll do it next term, or we'll do it the next academic year. And that really has changed. COVID has come along and prompted such a huge amount of change. We do need to be mindful that teachers and educators and school leaders are fatigued at the moment. They are, like our NHS and lots of other sectors, they're really knackered. They've worked incredibly hard to get to where we've got to. And companies who provide to them, RM included, need to be really sympathetic to that. But I think now that we've been through this change, let's not lose that momentum, I think, going forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Pete. Thank you for joining us this morning to talk about assessment. There's clearly a lot going on. If people want to catch up with some of the things you've talked about, where can they find you?
Yeah, well, a couple of good places. So rm.com is a good place to start. On there, you'll find all of the various RM sort of services and solutions and case studies and things that we're doing internationally. You're also very welcome to follow me on Twitter at rmpetercollison. Follow me and I'll be tweeting out on stuff that we're doing, mainly around assessment and other bits and bobs. So would be great to link up with anyone that's interested.
Thanks very much indeed, Pete. Thank you for listening, everybody. If you've got ideas you'd like us to talk about in one of our forthcoming conversations, do let us know. Meantime, good luck. I hope the teaching goes very well, and thanks, Pete. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.